Dr. Esposito is a university professor as well as a professor of religion and international affairs and of Islamic studies at Georgetown University. He has served as consultant to the U.S. Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian governments and corporations, universities, and the media worldwide. He has received several awards, including the American Academy of Religion's 2005 Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion. Dr. Esposito is editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Islamic World, the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, the Oxford History of Islam, the Oxford Dictionary of Islam, the Islamic World Past and Present, and Oxford Islamic Studies Online. He has published over 40 books and monographs, and his books and articles have been translated into 30 languages. Dr. Esposito interviews and publishes articles with newspapers, magazines, and the media in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, including, among others, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Times of London, CNN, and BBC. Dr. Esposito's talk is entitled, "Can We Find a Way to Bring Some Understanding Here Today?"
Assalamu alaikum. It seems appropriate, given the nature of my talk, to begin it with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I'm delighted to be here and to see so many of you here. This is a lot different than some of the meetings I used to go to 30 years ago, where all the families were outside and about 15 people were here to hear Siraj Wahhaj and I speak. Well, actually, more than that for Siraj Wahhaj, but there were 15 people when I got up to speak. I want to begin with an observation, and then I want to move to the heart of my talk. In 1993, I was invited to Georgetown University to create the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. It was a center that was a partnership between Georgetown and a group of Arab, Christian, and Muslim businessmen, basically from the Gulf area. They were concerned that after the Cold War, Islam would be seen as the next global threat. Our mission was to deal with the relationship between the Muslim world and the West and Islam and Christianity globally, because these are the two great religions that do in fact interface all over the world. But very quickly, we also began to deal with Islam in the West. However, after a track record of what I would have considered to be remarkable progress, 9/11 came along. And I remember my International Advisory Committee had a meeting. And Walid Khalidi, a very prominent Palestinian intellectual who has literally lived and worked all over the world in issues related to Palestine, at that time he was also a professor at Harvard, said to me that he thought the center had been remarkable in its years, but that 9/11 had set us back some 20 years. And I'm a realist, and being from Brooklyn, I'm street smart, but I tended to feel it would be 10 rather than 20 years. Well, here we are 10 years later. And that's what I want to work with. Where are we now, and where do we go? While post-9/11 necessitated the U.S. and Europe responses to counter international and domestic terrorism, this tragic event has been widely exploited by far-right neocons, hardline Christian Zionist right ministers, and those that follow that line, including members of Congress and administrations, such as Mr. Ashcroft in the last administration and others, and xenophobic forces. Islam and mainstream Muslims have been brushstroked with terrorism, equated with the actions of a fraction of violent extremists. Major polls by Gallup, Pew, Zogby, and others have reported the extent to which many Americans and Europeans have and continue to have a problem, not only with terrorists, but also with Islam and Muslims. What about the impact of 9/11 on the Muslim American community? Despite appeals by Presidents George W. Bush, of happy memory or unhappy memory, and his successor Barack Obama, Islam and Muslim Americans, brushstroke by 9/11 and post-9/11 attacks, have in fact been made to feel, as we saw with the Park 51 event, as if all Muslims shared a collective guilt. And certainly one sees that with the tsunami of anti-mosque activities after Park 51 and with the Sharia frenzy that we've seen. Indeed, polls show, such as the Gallup World Poll and others, that when Americans were asked, what do you admire about Islam and Muslims, 57% said nothing or I don't know. And indeed, polls both in America and Europe demonstrate the extent to which many question the loyalty of Muslims, advocate special monitoring of Muslims and mosques, and also indicate that they would be very uncomfortable with Muslims as their next-door neighbors. The growth of anti-Muslim bigotry, discrimination, hate speech, and violence, what some call Islamophobia, attacks against Muslims and mosques, has increased over the years rather than decreasing. What we have seen is a culture war, and I want to be clear about that. I don't want to get into the phrase of a clash of civilizations, but we have seen a culture war, and it is mirrored and promoted by the far right and by Islamophobic popular culture outlets. The media, Fox Television, Washington Times, New York Post, pundits like Sean Hannity, O'Reilly, Glenn Beck, Pipes, Savage, Ann Coulter, Bridget Gabriel, David Horowitz. 2 hours ago, I received an email from somebody in New Jersey, given how dumb and stupid the statement was. The fact that he had an Italian-American last name, I'm sure, was a pseudonym. He couldn't have been Italian-American. But in fact, what he in effect did was attack me, but attack me because of what his experts were. Sean Hannity, O'Reilly, and some nondescript lawyer. Organizations and activists like Pam Geller, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Robert Spencer, Frank Gaffney, and internet sites like Jihad Watch, Islamist Watch, American Thinker, Pajama Media, which sounds very much like something you'd see as an adult movie in a hotel, not that most of you would look at those. Front Page, The Right Side, and Family Security all promote this very skewed version of us and them. Militant Christian Zionist preachers, Pat Robertson, John Hagee, Rod Parsley, Franklin Graham, not only denounce terrorists, but denounce the religion of Islam itself as evil. And although many of them will cover themselves by saying, we're not saying all Muslims are like that, the fact is, at the end of the day, for a number of them, if you press them, you will get lines like 85% of the mosques are a problem, or they're a minority, but there are 200 million Muslims who are a problem. A new study by the Center for American Progress called Fear Incorporated, the Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America, points out, with no surprises, just looking at 7 foundations, that these foundations, whether knowingly or not, have in the last 10 years given more than $42 million to some of these folks. The fact is, that's the tip of the iceberg. They're just looking at those 7 foundations. We're not talking about what a lot of other individuals and groups have been giving to many of these people. The impact of this culture war can be seen in our 2008 presidential elections, President Obama having to be very careful about being associated with an Arab or Muslim. The few that he was associated with, immediately there were attacks, they backed off. The Republican candidates, virtually every one of them, in their playing the terrorism card, also blurred the distinction at the end of the day between terrorism and, in fact, Islam and the majority of Muslims. In fact, they didn't address that distinction. The 2010 congressional elections, which were completely off the wall, and it wasn't just the Tea Party. But the important thing there was to remember that we're not talking about European new parties that are xenophobic and anti-Muslim. We're talking about candidates in our mainstream parties, Democrats and Republicans, but principally Republicans, if you actually look at those voices. People who are not only in Congress and running for re-election, or governors and running for election, but people looking to make it into those positions, or potential presidential candidates like Newt Gingrich, who, as my dad would say to his 3 boys when he would disagree with us, "You're too bright to be that stupid." Gingrich with a PhD, a former Democrat who became a Republican, the first sign that he had fallen, but I'm not going to get into politics tonight, who then talked about not only the idea that he would introduce a federal law to ban Sharia in the United States. Problem is, who's calling for the imposition of Sharia, but also compared those who supported Park 51 to Nazis who would be demonstrating across from the Holocaust Museum. Congressional candidates who talked about young Muslims who would become interns in Washington and Congress as somehow being a 5th column. We see this in the Park 51 protest and the anti-mosque, and let me alert you, on September 13th, which is this week, on Frontline, there will be a major program on Park 51, and one that I would advise all of you to see. Not because one can expect that it will be overly controversial, but it is a program that I think will demonstrate that media can be a positive force as well as a negative force. The massacre in Norway is a tragic signal of the metastasizing of a social cancer, Islamophobia. What, in fact, a leading Israeli who is critical both of the Netanyahu government and of other policies in the United States referred to as the new anti-Semitism. When you actually look at the manifesto of this assassin, it points out not only the danger of these folks in America, but how there's a transnational connection, because many of the people that he was reading were, in fact, Americans. They were people like Robert Spencer and Jihad Watch. They were people like Pam Geller and others. Well, where do we go from here? What we need is a new narrative, or more specifically, a counter-narrative. We tend to function in America in this culture war on anecdotes, on what talk show hosts say. I normally don't answer these sort of hate emails, but today I decided to answer it. And the person began with, "Shame on you, Professor Esposito," at exclamation points, which is a lot cleaner in language than some of the stuff that I get. And he went on about what a disgrace I was for being anti-American and anti-Israel and never referring to anything specifically I said. And when I wrote back to him, and he referred to Sean Hannity, but when I wrote back to him, and I did point out to him various objective things that I had been doing and roles that I have played advising government and other institutions in America that are very respectable, he basically came back and said, "But this isn't as convincing, again, as what Sean Hannity and O'Reilly and others tell me." Well, a lot of this really is not fact, it's fiction. He never felt a reason to check out what they said. He never felt a reason to read about me or any of my Muslim brothers and sisters, my Christian brothers and sisters, and others to see what they say. They go with those single statements. So we need a counter-narrative based on facts, and we have those facts. In recent years, we have major polls so that we don't need to say, what does Bernard Lewis or Daniel Pipes or Robert Spencer say versus Esposito or whomever. We can actually go right to the source. We can find out what Muslims say, not what those of us say that Muslims say, however much we may function or not function interfacing with Muslims. We need to replace the shrill voices of militant Muslim bashers and opportunistic politicians like Peter King and others who are busy chasing funds and votes rather than reality. As we know, again, major polls for the last few years by Gallup and Pew in particular have demonstrated that Muslims are as much a part of the American mosaic as every other religious group and non-religious group, and indeed often have a leg up. They are educationally, economically, and politically integrated, and in particular, educationally and economically, at the top, competing with other groups. Educationally, they are second to American Jews. Economically, they are equal and at times better than your average non-Muslim American. But how many Americans are aware of that? How many of the countercultural people who are out there, the politicians, the media commentators, the Islamophobes, ever refer to these facts? And if they see them, they attempt to simply dismiss them, as the wife of a senior Bush administration dismissed an Arab-American reporter who said before America went into Iraq, you know, this is going to have a blowback effect. And she looked and said, why? And the person said, well, there are major polls. And indeed, you can find statements coming out of the State Department that deal with needing to be aware of this. Her response was, a person with a PhD, married to one of the top members, right near the top of the administration. She said, well, then they're wrong. This is a problem that we need to deal with in America. And it's a problem that the Muslim community faces. If I hear one more time the idea that Muslims could not have been involved, extremists, in the attacks on 9/11, because, as I was told in Kuwait, by a Kuwaiti who said, my brother is a pilot for Kuwait Airways, and he told me, no Muslim could learn how to fly a plane to do that. To which my response was, I'm glad when I leave tonight, I'm not going to be on Kuwait Airways, and your brother's not going to be the pilot. You know, there are a lot of things that we don't want to hear about. There are a lot of realities. We have our religious traditions. The problem is, we know what our ideals are, but we have nasty realities. Religion has a transcendent side, but all religions have had a dark side. We need to keep that in perspective, otherwise we cannot move forward. Otherwise, we argue past each other. Non-Muslims look at Muslims and say, this is what my faith or my beliefs are, referring to ideals, and then they compare it to extremist Muslims, and vice versa. And so we talk past each other all the time. Key findings recently that came from the Abu Dhabi Gallup report demonstrate and provide a very good starting point. They provide a different picture of Muslims in America today. As I said earlier, Muslim Americans are among the most integrated, but guess what? They're among the most optimistic. I would argue almost unrealistically optimistic. Many of you actually believe in the American dream. Well, I'm blessed. My wife and I are part of that American dream. But let me tell you, that's not the average American's lot in life. But you are at a time when Many non-Muslim Americans are in a different place. The good news about that is Obama can count on you for a vote. He's got to worry about the others. But the reality of it is most Americans are not aware of that optimism. What they're also not aware of at the same time is that you're a unique community. Post 9/11, a community that is educationally so well placed, so well integrated, a community that at the same time can say that post 9/11, they are, either they or people they know or people they know in their community are under siege from unwarranted profiling, from government infringement often on their mosques and their lives, despite the fact that often the heads of these agencies say very positive things. There's an uneven application of policies and laws, but at the same time that Muslim Americans say that, Muslim Americans talk about being optimistic about America, being happy in America despite that problem, and being optimistic about their future economically, etc., in the next few years. In contrast to many Americans who question their loyalty, overwhelming numbers of Muslims see themselves in their community as loyal Americans, some 93%. Overwhelming numbers of Muslims, more than non-Muslims, have a problem with justifying attacks against civilians. So, how do we move forward? What's involved in the way forward? Some of this sounds very basic, but it's very important. We have time. I used to in the old days say that the only thing I shared in common with Gaddafi and Castro was my ability to go on and on. Well, now we don't want to talk about Gaddafi, but since I still like a good Cohiba cigar, Castro's still, and Cuba is still on my page. The way forward is first and foremost education. Now, if I said that, or if I heard somebody say it, I would immediately look at my BlackBerry, and I see all of you who are. And that's why hell was created. But I don't want to motivate you. And that includes iPhones. But the reality of it is, I've seen what education can do. When I got into the field 40 years ago, nobody studied Islam. A couple of universities taught Islam. It was not taught in our primary schools, our high schools, our colleges, our universities. That simple. In fact, when I took my first job at the College of the Holy Cross, they didn't want me to come to teach Islam. They wanted me to teach world religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. And even at that, when I ran into a faculty member in the summer, he said, "What do you teach?" I said, "I teach Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. I'm trained in all of these." He said, "You won't last more than a year." So it wasn't just Islam, it was all those other religions. Look at where we are today. Muslim mosques and Islamic centers, Hindu temples are part of our landscape, not only here in the great Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, but even when you go to the jungles of Mississippi or Georgia or all those places where, if you're raised in Brooklyn, are as foreign as Timbuktu. The reality of today educationally is that Islam is taught in our schools, and that the next generation, in fact 2 generations, have been trained. And so when you actually look at polls, both because of education and because your average kid, unless their parents are very wealthy and send them to a posh, segregated school, go to public schools, they are schooled in multi-ethnic and multi-religious schools. And so when you look at prejudice, it's usually the older generation that are more prejudiced than the younger generation at a level of generalization. When it comes to education, we at Georgetown have a Muslim woman who is beyond belief, Susan Douglas. You go to our website and you will see information on the kinds of courses and materials that she uses. It is the most creative program to educate. We offer free to high school teachers across the United States a one-day workshop on Islam, and others do this too. But you're not only educating the next generation of students, but of teachers. But the real challenge, from my point of view, are the next generation of religious leaders. It's the imams, it's the rabbis, it's the priests and the ministers. That's where kids get their introduction to religion. They grow up in their parents, and now their kids are influenced both by the religious leaders and by their parents. And if they continue to have an education secular-wise that's here, but religiously that's here, then where are we in terms of the future? And that's part of the challenge I'll come back to. The next area, and the community has grown incredibly in this area, but it's got to ratchet it up even more, is community involvement. Greater engagement at every level of society. You know, people will often say, well, what can I do? You know, I'm not a wealthy entrepreneur, although most wealthy entrepreneurs in the Muslim community, we all know this, right? They're what I call photo op Muslims. So they want a photo op with the president, whoever he may be, or the mayor, and therefore they're very careful about who they're seen with or what they give their money to. But we don't want to go there right now. If you are a wealthy Muslim who wants to prove that you're not like that, I will take your check right after my talk. But the reality of it is, it's at every level. If you are in a community, it's getting involved in the schools, in community programs where you interact with your neighbors, not to do a da'wah, which is preaching your faith, but to do a da'wah, which is witnessing to the values of your faith and what that stands for. And that's where you connect with everybody else. It is important for us to take seriously. We can't just expect that the non-Muslim community is supposed to be aware of xenophobia and Islamophobia and do something about it and racism. It's important for the community to be actively involved. And that's a risky thing. Everyone has to wonder today about what they will say. If they say something, will somebody note it? Will that become a problem in terms of the way they will be evaluated? Well, the fact is, we can all share our hate mail. Karen Armstrong and I are not Muslims, but I'll bet you we can probably trump some of you in terms of some of the hate mail that we get. We are called to stand up and speak out for what we believe. You can't just quote your scriptures. You can't just quote prophetic traditions and refuse to follow that path. I'm not saying everybody has to do that. I don't want that on my conscience. But we have to have members in the community that step up. It's only if the community is out there that you then can get partners outside of the community. We need to reclaim the transcendent side of our religion. And what does that mean? Now I'm going to move into an area that some of you will be uncomfortable with. But that's okay, because I'm leaving immediately and you don't know where I live. Look, the reality of it is we have all been raised in faiths that have sacred scriptures that if you read them closely and when it's convenient, we talk about the fact that we all believe in love of God and love of neighbor, right? Love of God and love of neighbor. Common Word talks about that. But what's the dirty little secret? The dirty little secret is, who's the neighbor? And for many of us, the way we were raised is that the neighbor is really not somebody of another faith. And that, in fact, the neighbor is really not somebody of our own faith who disagrees with what our imam told us or what we believe. I remember lecturing in Saudi Arabia. And in Saudi Arabia, they had an Egyptian, he was described as an Egyptian fundamentalist, who took a degree from Oxford. Very interesting comparison here, interchange. And I went to lecture, and there was this huge turnout, and he was in the audience. And he got up, and he said, at the end of it, because he was upset that many of the Muslims were responding well, and he said, it doesn't matter what you say. He said, because according to our tradition, no matter what you say or do or believe, and no matter how good you are, if you're not a Muslim, you're going to hell. But even worse than that, as I went around, and I had gone to Imam Saud University to lecture on, and this was 15 years ago. I think it was the first non-Muslim ever invited to speak on Islam. He had put a rumor out that I had shown slides in Saudi Arabia on my last talk of nude women. I thought, that's amazing. I thought I only had those in my house. I'm only kidding. I'm glad my wife isn't here tonight. And I kept thinking, where could he get? And then I realized I never showed slides in Saudi Arabia, but the year before they asked me to show slides of Islamic centers and American mosques. So I showed slides with women, Bengali Muslim women, who were sorry, but their midriff showed. Now, he never said that that's what I did, but that was the nude image. Now, then I'm in Connecticut 10 years ago, and I keynote a major Muslim meeting. You'll note when you hear older people talk, not that I'm older, but I notice my brother Siraj has a white beard. I got smart, I shaved mine off. But often what we do, some of us, is when we refer to anything that we do, we say things like, I keynoted an important meeting. God forbid we should say, I keynoted an unimportant meeting. But in any case, I keynoted this meeting, and this bus driver from Connecticut, who was Jordanian, came over to me. I didn't know him. He put his arm around me. He said, Brother John, wallahi, you've been such a good brother, and you're out there for the Muslim community. Now, this is 10, 15 years ago. And he said to me, but you know you're not getting any younger. And I knew exactly what he meant. You're not getting any younger. Seize the moment, because God forbid you die as a believer or a non-believer, a good person, somebody who fights for a cause or whatever. You're not going to get saved. So my comment to most of my Christian and Muslim friends is that sometimes I feel that every time I go out among believers, I come back less a believer, because I see a kind of, and some of you have heard me say this, I haven't used it for a few years, a kind of salvation motif, which is Hyatt Regency with the glass elevators. The way you know you're going up is you've got to see people going down. And so when you get up and there's this huge ballroom and it's packed, you are disappointed. You work so hard and everybody's in here, it seems. And so you point and say, you let him in? I mean, he's okay, but not as good as me. And I remember saying this to a Baptist friend, and she said, you know, my father is a committed minister, and he's a good man, but he believes only Baptists are going to be saved. And I told my dad, you know, there's this story about a group of Christians who die, and they get to heaven, and St. Peter welcomes them at the gate, and they see the magnificence of heaven. It's grand, mansions, wonderful lawns, everything is beautiful. And then they see a kind of house in the distance. It's big, but it's not a mansion. And they say, who's there? And St. Peter says, it's the Baptists. And they think they're the only people up here, and they're enormously happy. Our challenge today, if we're going to move forward and talk about national unity, is to fight on every front I've mentioned, but also within our own religious traditions. We have to marginalize our preachers of hate. And it's not only the preachers who talk about violence and terrorism. It's the preachers that create a black and white world, as was mentioned earlier. When you create a black and white world, it creates a world of us and them. We have to transcend that. The Quran talks about people of the book. The Quran talks about the fact that God could have created one nation, but chose to create different people. Our religious traditions do have a doctrine that allows us to build a healthy doctrine in which we can affirm our faith, but recognize that truth does exist in other faiths. So let me move to my final comment. The 10th anniversary, the memorial commemoration of September 11th, provides an opportunity to remember those who suffered and died on 9/11, victims, firefighters, police of every faith, Many people forget that Muslims were involved and died in this situation, as were people of every faith and of no faith. All are brothers and sisters. But also it's a time to recognize the critical need to build and to strengthen bridges of mutual understanding and respect that are based on a counter-narrative. Truth is stranger than fiction. Stranger than the fiction constructed by the bigotry, racism, and fear-mongering that has infected our popular culture, our society, and too often our religious traditions or elements of it. Now is the time to reassess and rebuild our national unity on facts, not fiction, to make a long-standing American belief and tradition and to put it at the heart of our American identity. What's at the heart of America's identity? E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Neither a denial of the many nor of the one. Unity in diversity. The same thing we see with the Ummah and its expressions all over the world. That phrase on the seal of the United States, adopted in 1782, was the de facto motto of the United States until 1956, when it was succeeded by an act of Congress adopting "In God We Trust." And think about what that means for building our way forward. We put ourselves under the umbrella, all of us, whomever we are, of "In God We Trust," and under the umbrella within "In God We Trust" of a belief in out of the many, one. Thank you.